Hi, this is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today we're talking with Dr. Rachel Bowser. Rachel is Assistant Professor of English at Georgia Gwinnett College. Hi, Rachel. How you doing?
Hi, Steve. I'm good.
All right. Rachel, I wanted you to tell our audience a little bit about how you use Darwin and the origin of species in your English classes.
Right. Okay. Well, so I am a Victorianist by training. So I wrote my dissertation on Victorian novels, and I have one of my chapters is in fact on H.G. Wells and Darwin and Charles Lyell, who wrote Principles of Geology in 1832, real influential for Darwin. So when I think about 19th century literature, I usually think about it in terms of how it's interacting with the science of the period and how it's been influenced by some of the things that Darwin and Lyell were writing about. So when I teach 19th century literature in my lit classes, I'm always asking the students to think about the context of 19th century England and the way concepts of identity were changing during the period. So we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the impact that has, and coming off the previous century's French Revolution and the impact that has. We talk about Lyell and Darwin and the way those texts change conceptions of time, the way they change conceptions of man's role in the universe, the way they change conceptions of what institutions have the authority to tell us things about humanity and about time. Those kind of provide a framework for how we think about a lot of the texts, but I actually teach origin, but I teach Descent of Man, in fact, a little bit more even than I teach origin. There's a passage at the end of Descent of Man, and I'm sure you know it, where I think it's literally at the end, where Darwin writes that it's something like, while man may feel some pride at having risen to the top of the food chain instead of having been placed there, and while he should feel proud of all of these accomplishments, art and civilization and government and all those sort of things, he still bears on his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origins. So I love that passage.
Yeah, me too.
It's useful for me because when I'm asking the kids to think about the 19th century and identity categories, I'm asking them to think about the rise of the middle class in a lot of ways, and how you shift from a society organized on the basis of rank, which has to do with birthrights, and rank you can tell who someone is within a society by what they look like, from their exterior, how they're dressed, where they live, to rising middle class and sort of middle class values, which are all about this idea that, everybody's identity is internal, and that we have values and that we have ambitions and we have hopes and dreams and these things that sort of allow us upward mobility and to change our station and whatever. So I'm asking them to think about the kind of shift from thinking of identity as signified via external means to thinking of identity as things that live inside, things that are defined by values and immaterial things. So that Darwin quote, for me, the way that it puts those two ideas in tension, right? It's saying, even though we have art, we have government, we have emotions, we have all these things that we think of as like in the head and internal, we also have on our frames the stamp of our lowly origin. So our external bodies keep saying something about our identity, even if it's not what we want our internal self to say about our identity. So that quotation kind of gets at a tension that I feel like I'm asking them to see.
That's and one of my favorite quotes ever. And how do your students respond to that? I mean, we both teach in Georgia here, right in the heart of the Bible Belt. And what kind of reactions do you get from one just teaching Darwin in a literature class, and from that particular quote and the tension that it brings?
Yeah, that's a good question. I taught at a branch campus at the University of South Carolina before I was here, so fairly similar demographics. Hold on, let me send the phone away. And I had a kid in my lit class there ask me what alternative text he would be given to read if he didn't feel like it was appropriate to read the Darwin. He wanted to have an alternative 19th century creationist text that he could read. And that was the same year, Steve. You remember that was the year that was the, 150th anniversary, or it would have been 150th anniversary maybe where there was those groups on campus that were passing out the edited versions of Origin of Species, right?
Yeah, yeah, led by that actor.
Yeah, Mike Seaver.
Yeah.
Cameron. Yeah.
Yeah, Cameron, exactly.
So that was happening at the same time. So I was able to sort of talk about that and talk about, why you don't get an alternative to Darwin. There's no alternative to his being influential. Like, he was influential, sort of full stop. I haven't had that happen here yet, but I did have a kid. I got a terrible student evaluation after this summer from a kid who said that I taught Darwin in an English class that had no business being there, and he felt like it was a violation of his belief system. So, I think I've dealt with a little bit of fallout from it. The reason that I always put it on there is because they have such misconceptions about what's happening in those texts, right? Like, they have been just completely sold a bill of goods about what Darwin is and what his ideas are, right? Like, they're shocked when I tell them that Darwin wasn't an atheist when he was writing Origin of Species, that Darwin wasn't an atheist when he was writing Descent of Man. They're shocked. They can't believe it, right? They don't really understand what natural selection means. So when I teach Origin of Species, I teach it to explain what natural selection means, but also to emphasize the extent to which Darwin was invested in proving biodiversity in that text, which they've never heard of in conjunction with him, right? Like, that's a totally new idea that he might have cared about that. And he has so many passages in Origin where he sort of waxes poetic about the beauty of the creation and of all the things in it, so they're stunned to see those. So I always think that's useful. And then when I teach Descent of Man, I really emphasize the extent to which he had abolitionist intentions with that text and really wanted to use it to prove that all races are genetically the same, et cetera, et cetera. So they're always really surprised about that because somebody somewhere along the way has told them Darwin, was into eugenics and wanted to sort of sterilize anyone that was abnormal in some way. So I feel like, I'm glad to be a specialist in the period that I'm in and have Darwin in there because I think he's just so rich and useful. But I also feel like, become something of a mission to teach those texts just because, these students are so wrong about them, so many of them. And you feel sort of obligated to help them understand this is one of the major intellectual thinkers of the last 300 years. You can't misunderstand him that grossly.
Yeah, and there seems to be commonly a huge misunderstanding, and you nailed it, the idea that people just simply don't even know what natural selection is. They have this idea that Darwin's bad because he somehow has driven these other scientific disciplines or been associated with, I had one student who said, well, Darwin is what gave Hitler his ideas.
They all think that.
Not really. There's no evidence for that, right? So let's talk about the other end of it.
He did, right? Even if Darwin did give Hitler his ideas, let's even say that that's true. How is that Darwin's fault? Like, nobody's calling it the Bible's fault that the Bible gave Hitler some of his ideas.
Exactly.
It's just this ridiculous thing.
Exactly. So let's talk about the other end of it, because this project is really about getting evolution out there, and I'm really impressed when I heard that the English department, English group, was teaching Darwin, and you in particular. It really excited me because it is well written, and like you said, he waxes poetic, and it's really interesting stuff. Have you had any responses where students may have been showing a bit of trepidation about studying Darwin, and then, like, click, they got it?
Yeah, I do think that happens. And honestly, those couple cases that I mentioned where students write up something negative or ask for something alternative, those are outliers for sure. The majority of the students, in the response papers that they write after they read Darwin, they write things like, number one, I'm shocked at how beautiful this is. I thought it would read like a science text. It doesn't read like a science text. It's gorgeous. And that's the other thing, is that you have to explain to them what it means to be a naturalist, right? And that, like, scientist doesn't exist in the way that they think it exists in the middle of the 19th century, and here's naturalism and whatever. So they like it for all those reasons, I think, just rhetorically in terms of how it reads. But I do find that most of them feel like there's a sort of light bulb whenever they get this idea of natural selection clarified for them. Like, they have this idea, they've all learned this phrase, survival of the fittest. And so this thing that they think, but it's the thing, right? And so this thing that they think about, this thing that has to do with everybody sort of elbowing each other out and, every man for himself, and it's a cruel world and all this sort of thing. Like, when you talk about it, when you talk to them about it in terms of reproduction and in terms of sort of chances for reproductive success, and you talk about it, and so I usually start with botany, and that's mostly what's in Origin of Species because it's easiest for them to grasp, you know. Okay. Then they get it, I feel like, right? They get that concept, and then for me, it's so easy to move from there to the kind of condition of the urban centers in London and Manchester in England as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and how that kind of increased diversity of opportunity also, you know, creates a scarcity of resources, and what kind of urban living problems do we have and whatever. So for me, that text sets up an incredibly nice way to think about the way social problems can be understood metaphorically through the same metaphors that science uses to set up its particular conclusions. So I think it works for them. I do. I think it helps them sort of see the period that I'm asking them to see in a different way.
That's fantastic. Now, let me just ask you one last question here, and then we can sign off. The question is this: are you an outlier in English education in teaching Darwin? Or do you feel that it's a relative commonality that English professors are teaching this as part of this period of writing?
Yeah, okay. So I think I'm an outlier in English in that I'm more scientific.
Let's just clarify. You're an outlier, period. But
so, we'll have that on the table. A, period. B, I do think I'm an outlier in English in that I'm more sciencey than the discipline at large. So I think that it's not necessarily the case that in American and British literature and in all sorts of periods, people are incorporating a lot of science writing into their texts, or just are as geeked out about science stuff as I feel. However, I do think Darwin is pretty common in 19th century syllabi, right? Like, it's a pretty important text in terms of the period. So I do think it gets, if not explicitly taught a lot, discussed a lot. I don't know that I have a lot of Victorianist colleagues that actually make them read pages and pages of Origin and Descent, but I do think it gets discussed a lot. You can almost not discuss it, or you almost can't not discuss it, right? And, you know, there's a pretty big field of scholarship, right? Like, there were really important books. They're old now, you know, they're 90s now, like Gillian Beer's Darwin's Plots, a handful of others who are writing about the conversations between Darwin and literature in the period, who are writing about the way Darwin is such a reader and uses sort of literary metaphors in his texts about how the novels of the period incorporate Darwin's ideas. So I think in terms of the 19th century, it's a pretty well-established interdisciplinary connection.
Okay, super cool. All right, I did say that was my last question, but I lied. Okay. Tell us about your recent idea for a research project, which you came to our lab meeting a couple weeks ago and just basically blew our mind.
Well, Adrian's going to be mad at me because Adrian gave me this lecture about how humanists don't understand that you can't talk about the research before you do it because I'm going to poison the results. So this is your fault. No.
Okay, yeah, blame me.
Okay, so we have this category of faculty evaluation at Georgia Gwinnett College, student engagement, right? So we have the normal ones, teaching, research, et cetera, but we have student engagement, which means we're supposed to be we're supposed to be engaging students. I mean, how do you understand it, actually? This would be helpful for me. If you were to define student engagement to a colleague that's not at Georgia Gwinnett, how would you define it?
I mean, you know, what I would probably do is define it through an example, right? And I would say the way that I engage students is by encouraging them to get involved in research, talking to them after class, meeting with them at the lab, encouraging them to go to conferences, that sort of thing. You know, all the kinds of things that you do as part of I would call a normal scholarship route in an institution. Just giving them the opportunity, basically, you know, opening the doorway for them to be engaged with me, actually. Because that's really what the students want. Now, there are some students who demand a little bit more sort of pedagogical engagement, and that's different. But I think that the engagement that really becomes mentoring as opposed to just like telling somebody what courses to take, which becomes mentoring, is that sort of like putting your arm around somebody and saying like, okay, we can do this together type of thing. The kind of relationship that I have with Ryan and Tia, where we're publishing papers together and going to conferences together and really almost seeing them as on a level as a colleague. I mean, obviously they know that I've got a little bit more education under my belt, but I appreciate their opinions. And we come up with research ideas together and showing them that I value their opinion. I mean, that's what I put on my student engagement section,
Yeah, okay, so that's totally, I think that's accurate. And I think that's most people would recognize that as accurate in terms of what we do. You're talking about it mostly in terms of helping to professional,ize them, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of people talk about it in terms of helping to professionalize them. And I think also a lot of people talk about it in terms of something that's kind of the line between mentoring and counseling, right? Like helping to identify when they're having personal problems that are going to get in the way of their academic performance, trying to direct them towards resources to deal with those sorts of things. So it's a kind of ill-defined category, right? Mm-hmm. For all these reasons. So I have this thought that, or I have this theory, that if a person were to write up her student engagement activity, and if a person is a woman, that to a body of academic professionals who are not at Georgia Gwinnett College and are not familiar with the category, that write-up is less likely to be construed as work than when it's written up as by a man, because I think that for the average reader conditioned in heteronormative constructions of gender, I think that the things that a person is likely to write up are, when they're coming from a woman, likely to be read as extensions of sort of maternal or female characteristics, nurturing and mentoring and looking out for people, whereas when those things are written up by a man, they're much more likely to be coded as work. Okay. So I think that women are sort of disproportionately disadvantaged in terms of professional mobility by the existence of this category.
And it's interesting, and you and I have talked about this. I think that's a product of our evolved psychological mind. That is, as a perhaps a part of our ancestry where we were hunter-gatherers, women were the nurturers, men were the hunters. So for a man to stick around and nurture is out of maybe his realm. And I've been trying to think of an alternative experiment where you could, a woman who goes out hunting might be considered more work, where for a man to go out hunting, if you will, quote unquote, it's, well, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do, right? And I hate to use those words, supposed to or ought to, but that's kind of what it's tapping.
So that's the thing for you and me, right? Because we sort of actually see all the same things, I feel like, in the world. We have different sort of informing paradigms, right? Mine is so much more likely to be social construction than yours is. And so then I feel like, and this is the thing I feel like, is that you guys, I feel like the thing with evolutionary, the thing with evo psych is that fine line between ought and is, right? Like, this is the way the world is versus this ought to be the way things go because this is the way natural selection has designed it, right? So that's that line, right?
Well, and then the line becomes even more gray when we start talking about perceptions of what ought and is are, right? Because our perception of what is oftentimes very misconstrued based upon what we think ought to be the shape of the world. And so it's a hard thing. No, you're right. And I think evolutionary psychologists oftentimes get in trouble for saying things like, that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way it is. It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. Or even a phrase like, that's the way it's designed, right?
Yeah.
Like that's tricky, right? Because there's so much agency in design, right? It has these connotations of like, a teleology of progress. That's the way it's actually, that is the way it's supposed to be. It's better and better and better and designed to get better.
Right. And it lends some people to think that it's not malleable, right? That if that's the way it's designed, then that's the way it's designed. And why would we ever think of fixing it, or why would it ever change? Because lots of people have misconception about evolution being progress.
Yeah, that, and it's interesting. I actually didn't think about that when I was talking about the students and the evolution, but that's a thing that I often talk about when I teach origin, is I draw this, it's so lame. I draw this tree and talk about this tree.
Yeah, no, I do the same thing.
And I actually talk about the sort of adding of branches and how we're not, you know, every now and then the ones at the bottom fall off, but we're not talking about a tree that's streamlining up into one point. We're just talking about shit getting more complicated as it continues, right? So that's one of those misconceptions they have too, right? They think that it's supposed to be all moving towards this like androgynous being where everything is sort of simple and sophisticated and there's no complications.
Yeah, yeah, and that misconception is so concerning for students because what we're learning now from some work out of the Evolutionary Institute and Evolutionary Studies program is that the understanding of and I would really be interested to talk to you about this with your students, but what David Sloan Wilson, who's headlining this project here, has found is that if you teach students, undergraduate students, about how natural selection works, and you assess their knowledge before they enter the class and then after they enter the class, their degree of improvement of understanding natural selection and evolution is a good predictor for improvement in GPA. And the theory is that, you know, natural selection is such a simple way of thinking about organizing lots of complex ideas. So now you go into classes and you have time management, organization of homework projects, et cetera, it can all maybe fall into place. And be interested to see if your kids who get it do better later.
Right. Is that distinct from, you know, and I assume that this is saying as distinct from anything else. Like if I measure the difference between how well my students understand the causes and impacts of the French Revolution before class versus after class.
Yeah,
and
I don't know that.
I wonder if that's interesting. I would be really interested in knowing more about that.
Yeah, okay. I'll try and get you some of that information. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to talk to us. The video cast will be processed through the magazine and up in a little bit, and I'll send you that link once we have it.
That sounds great. Thanks for asking.
All right, later.
See ya.